Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today, Marco. I really appreciate you joining us all the way from Germany. So a little bit of a time zone jump, and thanks for making it work. I'd love to start with just hearing a little bit about yourself and sort of what your history's been and what's led you to sort of where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. Thanks for having me on. So I am working in the broader L&D, learning and development field. I'm currently leading the function of capability development in a consulting company. I personally come from a bit of an unusual field, that kind of a little unusual path that led me there. But initially, I've studied information sciences and librarian studies, and then worked as a system administrator for a couple of years at a university library before moving over to a consulting company. Having worked there as an analyst for many years, I kind of gradually moved in towards training these analysts and training employees in that professional services firm. And then kind of after, about 7 or 8 years, made a complete transition away from my analyst field towards the L&D function. And I've been working in that field now for over 15 years, mainly in consulting environments, professional services environments.
Oh, amazing! That's a bit of a varied background, like librarian. So how did you make the sort of change from librarian to like a systems sort of a focus?
Yeah, I think so. When I did my university studies, it was the time when I think libraries and universities more in general were making a really fundamental change from an analog world into a digital world. So kind of started with lots of books around me, and then when I finished my studies, there were all computers around me. And I think it was actually quite an interesting time when you saw that these massive data-driven organizations were suddenly have to figure out how to move into a digital world. It used to be then a lot of really, IT systems that were needed in order to make this whole thing work. And that was kind of, while I was doing my studies, I transitioned from, I would say, the more academic field of that side towards really like a tech side of this field, and then moved into the tech industry, and then moved into tech industry consulting. I think it was, from hindsight, it was pretty natural evolution, but it is indeed a bit odd when you look at it from the front side of it. I agree. Yeah.
Oh no, that's unreal. That's awesome. And then so you've sort of got a bit of a background in systems, and you've gone from systems to sort of capability development and building and L&D. I have a friend who works at a mining company in Australia, and he actually has a similar background, and I think it services him very well because he's able to sort of really understand the nitty-gritty in systems and how the data might work or something like that. So I'd love to learn a little bit about that sort of jump as well. The jump from more of a sort of a sysadmin kind of a role into the HR space. What led you into sort of changing? Because one is very logical and one is very people focused, right? They're sort of different coins.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, so the system side, the system administration, which is really an IT side administration, that was necessary because the library environment kind of needed suddenly these ecosystems, right, to be in place. So you suddenly discover yourselves being suddenly in charge of mainframes and elaborate software programs that need to run the library acquisition or the library lending system, and make sure that all those data flows are kind of working out and the synchronization with data sets works. And I think that kind of equips you a little bit for that industry of hardware, software, and also services, associated to these IT environments. I think from there, then it was, for me, a natural, evolutionary step to say, okay, what is the bigger picture behind that? And the bigger picture kind of moved me into the consulting and analyst field, where I was working then as an analyst in consulting companies, and looking towards, what are the industry trends more generally in hardware, software, and services, and also adjacent and related tech fields. I kind of broadened my scope here from tech fields, from the classic IT environment, then to other areas as well. But the jump, I would say, from this tech-driven ecosystems towards L&D came for me really because I was a participant at a training program, and that was a training program around business consulting skills. And I think I kind of resonated very positively with that, with the whole experience, with the whole idea of how humans learn and how we learn in teams and how we learn with cases and what different, skills and capabilities are really part of this learning process and how it all works, or sometimes how it doesn't work. And I think that kind of, it triggered my curiosity. And I was then gradually over the course of 2 to 3 years kind of being more drawn into this environment of learning and development and working with people really on that one. That today, L&D does have a lot of systems, software services, hardware as well. I think I don't have to tell you, you know that very well, and the listeners, the viewers probably know this as well. So I think the increasing importance of tech in a lot of, how we think about L&D, sort of say for me is a bit of a flashback back to the times when, the digital world crashed into the analog world of libraries, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely see how that experience is something that you could draw from quite easily and really give you a bit of a leg up there. I think the L&D world is still going through that that sort of that mix of analog and tech coming through. That's a really varied sort of pathway that you've had to get here, which is so cool and super unique. If you had to distill down like one lesson or one thing that you would say to other HR practitioners or L&D practitioners coming into the space, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think of course, I think from today's perspective, you can go to certain schools or colleges, universities, and kind of go directly into the functional field of HR or talent-related professions. And I think that's fine, right? I think it is absolutely fine to go sort of say directly into this functional field and make your experiences there, do internships, graduate, start working in this field. And yet at the same time, I also found it personally really beneficial if there is just a separate, so to say, stream of input that is part of shaping one's career. And that could be any field. I think there are things that a lot of colleagues I've seen were working in engineering kind of areas, we're working in tech backgrounds, but also in more people related like sales or customer related fields like sales or marketing. So I think my so what probably is here that you can go directly into the function, but it can be very enriching and actually very beneficial down the road if you may have come from a completely different field and want to explore, so to say, a second career or a next phase of your career by moving from one side to another function. The only challenge is when you do this really with the first step, the first time, so to say, to endure this first 1 year or maybe 2 years where of course you are not the expert in L&D. Of course you haven't maybe facilitated training programs so much. You gotta give yourself time to also learn the expert side of that. But I think it helps if you gradually expose yourself more and more to those things by participating in training programs, by reading up on the literature or following maybe influences around it, or some things like this podcast, to kind of just explore a little bit this world and then gradually start to expose yourself more and more. I think that can be very beneficial if different disciplines come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would definitely echo that. Don't be scared and jump in and definitely give yourself the time. I guess HR is one of those fortunate business areas where you get to touch every aspect of an organization, and not all areas do. I guess on that front, and with HR being able to reach out and sort of touch everything and having people with different background and experiences, how have you found aligning L&D strategy with the overall business strategy, and is there a way that you found that to be executed successfully in the past, and are there some things to maybe look out for there?
Yeah, I think so. Usually when you work in the field of say, let's say, learning and development, you would, in my understanding, be a part of the broader HR function. And of course, I mean, whenever you start working in L&D or HR, you orientate yourself around what's happening at, so to say, the strategic corporate level. You cannot work really in isolation. You have to say what's the business strategy, what's the bigger business direction that you're going to. But I think that what I would encourage people is to proactively inquire about this and ask for documentation or even evidence, something in writing that gives you, so to say, a foundation to react to with your own L&D or HR strategy. So sometimes, when people say, okay, let me kind of understand what our business strategy is, they have a few conversations around that, but very rarely do they then have something really in hand, which kind of is a true articulation and a manifestation of what the business strategy is, from which they can then deduct their own HR or L&D strategy pieces. And I think it helps to look at that in writing from the business, and how the business is articulating that gives you an opportunity to pick up, on the narrative, to pick up on certain keywords that they're using and kind of relate to that, to pick up on initiatives, or to maybe, even state that, look, this is a wonderful business strategy, but what we have in place on the talent HR side or on L&D side currently may not match that. And so we have a gap. And so let's talk about how we are addressing this gap. And so what I'm trying to say is, I think it does help to proactively engage with the business leaders, even if you're an HR leader yourself, or if you're an L&D leader, together with your HR and talent colleagues, to kind of do this together, but to really see in writing and then really think about and reflect about what the business strategy is and respond to that, in the form of a document. I think that's a good way to discipline, so to say, your thinking to reacting to something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like getting yourself involved is definitely something that would be critical, because it's easy to get left out, I think, if you don't if you don't make some noise as well sometimes, right? And what would you say are some of the challenges or some of the difficulties with aligning that business strategy with your L&D strategy with that business strategy?
Well, I mean, there can be numerous challenges, right? So I think let me mention a few of them as I've come across them. So for instance, that having a trust-based relationship, so to say, with your business leaders, which sometimes is just necessary, because these things like business strategies, talent, HR strategies don't fall from the sky, but are usually the project of intense conversations and maybe reiteration. So it's not like the first shot usually nails it, but it's an evolving process, and that requires a good relationship, so to say, with the business leaders, and even a certain level of trust. Now, if you're new to that role and may not have that exposure or that permission, so to say, to be closer to your business leaders and to develop that trust-based relationship, that can be very hard then, because this journey to move towards your own HR L&D strategy, well, how should it come into being if you do not have an iterative process that's based on trust, where you can even sometimes just bring out an idea and say, well, would this work? No. Okay, let me kind of go back and see if I can look at this differently, come back to you with a revised proposal. What do you think this is now? So I think you need that permission to engage in a discussion, and that requires certain proximity and exposure to business leaders, and that's not always so easy to achieve, right? So you need to make sure that you are having the opportunities to meet business leaders and engage with them, and then also be trusted, and sometimes be able to allow to make a mistake even, right, and correct this down the road.
Of course.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
That's
having the right
that's
thinking
one. That's
foundation.
one area. One challenge that I could think of. Another one is that I think HR, talent, L&D strategies. What I've come across some of them is they are sometimes in nature fluid and even reactive or more immediate, right? So let me give you an example. Suddenly, I don't know, a company acquires another company, and suddenly you have to deal with a new business situation. Right? You've got hundreds, if not thousands, of new people coming in. They come in with a totally different culture and ecosystem, so you need to make sure you kind of react to that. How much do you see this always coming in advance? Well, I'm not sure, like, hey, in 2 years we're making a business acquisition, so already prepare for that. So some of these things are more immediate to be dealt with, and then it's an immediate ask for the entire HR function to kind of make it work. And that suddenly kind of drops like a UFO, so to say, on your plate, and you have to deal with that situation. Or if you, I don't know, for instance, another challenge could be technology. You are suddenly having a new operating system, CRM system, sales system in place. You need to upskill and train your people, but you not necessarily see that coming several years before down the line, but it's relatively close to maybe the decision to acquire system A versus system B that this comes into the organization. And then, okay, well, how does our interventions, how do our training programs around this look like? How will it affect the business processes? So what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes the HR L&D responses are, answering to things that are coming up sometimes short notice and require a fix and sort of the way how to handle that. And that can be a challenge with limited resources, or when you are just having lots of other projects and suddenly this is the one extra that maybe you haven't resourced for, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that analogy of it just a UFO just landing, because I feel like when those acquisitions happen, or those in government, those machinery or government changes where everyone gets sort of jumbled up again, can sometimes fall out of the sky. Have you seen that done well anywhere before? Is there something that you've sort of learned from in the past, an experience of an acquisition or a merger where you've gone, oh, we really nailed this merger? Or is there anything where you would say, sort of, have any advice on how to bring those 2 or 3 or 4 groups of people together into one sort of one cohesive unit?
Well, I think if we speak of merger and acquisition specifically, I think every one of these has sometimes their own challenges, and I think probably or most likely it's not going to be just a cakewalk, but it's going to be quite challenging on all kinds of fronts, and not only HR and talent wise, also on tech, also on integrating the businesses really there. What I have, for instance, observed is that 2 things usually stand out for me. So the first one is culture, right? So the integration of different company cultures into each other, or integration is already a bit of a hard word. Let me say the mutual exploration of each other's company culture, let me put it like that, is a process that can take many years. So I mean, for those of your viewers, listeners who have maybe been on the receiving end of an acquisition, you will probably relate to this very well. There, you continue to say we and mean a certain community, even way beyond the time of where you have been acquired, maybe by a company, and you mean a certain group of people coming from a certain part of the organization. So I think until really a new company culture forms with a strong company culture joining another strong company culture, that can be quite a challenge. And I think companies have to endure that and accept that it's not happening overnight, and can actually be also quite interesting. Yeah, it can bring innovation. It can bring interesting discourse or consultation. So it even diverging cultures or cultures that are complementary can, sort of say, bring the company forward. But yes, it's also something to be aware of, and it's the elephant in the room kind of moment. Yes, we know that this doesn't integrate so wonderfully as we planned before, but it is what it is. A second thing that I've experienced a couple of times is when a new, so to say, company joins. Usually, it's that the functional processes. Let's say, how do we book our time? How do we invoices? What are the HR processes? I mean, usually there is a certain difference. Maybe some overlaps, but usually it's different processes, sometimes with different systems. And sometimes I would say business leaders will underestimate that the time it takes to move a certain population from one process on how to do business processes into another ecosystem and another business process. Could be anything really from, putting in your time, putting in your invoices, how do you, book your vacation dates, how do you record a sales opportunity, how do you develop clients, how do you deliver R&D or a product. All these things usually have a functional side, and when two companies come together, usually those things are a little bit different from each other. And to integrate those two things to make it a harmonious kind of lockstep process going forward is sometimes a challenge, and also takes some time, because you got to unlearn your old systems and processes and make sure you kind of move over to the new way of doing it. And that does take significant amount of upskilling or reskilling time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess on that upskilling and reskilling front, or even just in general, how would you go about uncovering what learning activities to do, and sort of how would you decide on how to I guess start to train and build that capability within those areas that might be brand new, or new people within the organization. I imagine sometimes when two organizations come together as well, one might have a really advanced, mature L&D function, and one may not. So have you got a sort of a process for that, or have you seen that work really well anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not really a cookie cutter approach, right? But I think there's a few things to maybe reflect on how you may want to do that. So and it doesn't really matter so much if it's really an M&A situation, or maybe, if you would say more generally, come into this L&D or talent function, if you will. So I think that there's a couple of things that you maybe have to ask for, and a couple of things that you may want to communicate on. So things that you want to ask for is that's intelligence gathering around what's the current state. So what is it that I'm finding here, right? So this includes what we talked earlier about. Do you have an idea about the corporate strategy, ideally in writing, and what does the business leaders prioritize? What's their focus on? Where do they want to take the company going forward? I think that's really essential to understand those business goals. What's very important is also to understand, let's say in your function, like, who are your top stakeholders, right? So in the business, who has a particular interest shown in the past or needs to show in what you're doing. That could be the CEO, that could be people on the C-level side, it could be maybe even people on the board, could be other functional leaders. But I would say if you need with your sponsor to answer that question, who are your top stakeholders, that's super important to kind of figure that out, because from there, these are people that you need to make sure you spend time with and understand their views and expectations towards your own work and your own function. I think what helps a lot is if you ask for, if there's an existing framework around how the company talks and thinks about competencies or skills. Some companies do have that. They do have a competency framework. Some companies don't have it, so to say, in writing, but have a bit of an understanding. But like, even the question for that can trigger, I think, very valuable responses and data points for you. Yeah, how do we think about it? How we talk about it? Do we have a language to talk about competencies and skills? I think also interesting to understand, and therefore a good ask is to say, okay, How has the past looked like? Was there an existing learning and development program? Were there, groups of faculty that were supporting training programs, like either internal or external? Do you have something like a learning management system or an ecosystem that supports the technology side of that? Were there content providers, again, internal or external ones? So what was that situation looking like up until now? So how does it look like? And even if the answer was we don't have anything, okay, fine, but then at least you know. And finally, I think it's good to ask also, like, okay, do we have an idea about, budget and spend? Was there an L&D or talent development or capability development relating budget or spending plan? And again, even if not, that's okay, but at least sort of say, and then you can understand, okay, were there costs associated with that? I mean, running a learning management system, that alone, requires a certain budget. Working with third-party content, that requires a budget. I mean, you don't have to have literal in-person training programs on the ground to sort of say need to have a budget. I mean, even the kind of status quo of just running a certain set of offerings requires that. So I think these are some of the asks that I would say are foundational that you would need to understand. And then in hand, I could imagine that I think you want to start by communicating a little bit to your environment, to those stakeholders, those top stakeholders that you've identified, but maybe also your peers or the team that you're working with around, I think, I usually use the horizons, so to say, different horizons on how to communicate around. So I think there is a short-term and a mid-term and a long-term horizon. Short-term horizons for me are a couple of months, 2-3 months. What is the outlook for the immediate near term? And that would involve things like, okay, what's my understanding of the business strategy? So how do I interpret what the business is telling me? So what do I deduct from that for my function? Who do I know are my key stakeholders, and who are my supporters? Faculty supporters or communities of practice that may be helping me with my function and with my plans. A mid horizon, maybe usually 3 to 6 months. Okay, that's how I understand it. Now, what do I translate this into? So what would that mean in terms of our offerings, the content, the programs that we're offering? What does it mean about the technology? Do we have a need for certain technology to support our offerings? Are there certain skills that we need to focus on? Are there certain competencies that we need to understand better? So it's, I think, taking the understanding and translating it into the first findings, and then a horizon which usually is like beyond 6 months up to a year, where you can continuously ask around, okay, so how do we want to measure ourselves with our proposed interventions, with our proposed programs for L&D or talent? What are low-hanging fruits that we could start to address right now in the organization? How do we build those communities of practice? How do we shape the culture? What kind of formats are really available for us? How do we have to balance virtual and in person? And what's our strategy towards regarding third-party content or providers? So balancing, asking, and communicating, I think, is probably helpful as you come into a position where you understand this function better and better.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love that horizon outlook and and breaking that down into those different sort of time periods and segments. You touched on a lot of stuff there that I'd love to get into, and I think one of the ones that would be really interesting to explore is early on you mentioned sort of competency. Sometimes they're referred to as capability frameworks in different areas. And some organizations do have them, and some don't have them. And I would probably, in my experience, lend towards the latter, and most of them, they like to talk about it and have a look at it, but they haven't gone down that pathway. If your organization maybe hasn't gone down that journey yet, how would you explore that? How would you go down that journey and start to look at those different competencies and turn that into something a little bit more meaningful for your L&D or HR practitioners to leverage?
It's also a very fascinating question, and it's a question which I think can be really helpful on a lot of other things down the road associated with L&D. So getting those
Absolutely.
foundations right at the very beginning may seem a bit theoretical to some of the to some people involved, or even some stakeholders. They say like, why are you bothering so much to figuring out a competency framework in the first place? But it can be very helpful down the road. For instance, when you organize your learning offerings, when you organize your LMS, when you are trying to identify, so to say, the content areas where you're collaborating with third-party providers. So it has many ripple effects down the road. How I usually look at that is, so for me, I think the prime distinction is between competencies and technical skills. And I would say, to maybe use a simple example here, excuse me, a competency is something that is almost role agnostic. So you're working in a company in a particular field, and within that company, the majority of the employees need to have certain core competencies and need to understand them and need to be able, so to say, to speak to them. They don't maybe need to give the textbook definition of that, but they need to understand why these competencies are necessary. And an example of that would be, so for instance, if you're working in a product company that is maybe producing, let's say, vacuum cleaners, right? So a competency must be, a certain level of technical understanding about the product that you're actually manufacturing, but you also probably need to have a foundational understanding of relationship building and sales and marketing in order to bring your product to market. Customer orientation probably is very important. If you're dealing with customers, you have to be very sound on maybe communication as you're explaining that to your customers about the product features, about things that you're getting to market with. So these are competencies that I think would touch most of the employees, where you have to have a certain understanding. Now, technical skills are role specific, and technical skills can really vary significantly. They could be either, a certain area of expertise. It could be a process, a framework. It could be a software that you know how to operate with. So, for instance, if you're a sales representative, your technical skills may be, for instance, on business development process, or on a certain CRM software, or maybe on telemarketing, things like that. But if you're an engineer, you may not need those kind of qualities, but you may need, for instance, being able to write code on the electronics part of it, or being better at understanding the supply chain, or the enterprise resource planning, or the manufacturing process. So I think technical skills are more related really towards your job, and they are associated with certain jobs within an organization. And competencies are more the umbrella understanding, so to say, that bind the entire employees together. Capabilities, if you will, I think sometimes people are using the term competencies and capabilities interchangeably. And I would say capabilities are allowing us to basically do our job and bring our best self, so to say, to our environment. So in a way, it's a combination of competencies and technical skills that allow us to fulfill the entirety of our professional requirements within our professional environments. I think that would be maybe an even bigger umbrella in my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned some of those ripple effects early on, where if you've got this foundation in place, and it can be useful in quite a lot of a lot of different areas. I'd love to learn. So once you do have that foundation in place, where have you seen, I guess, a lot of value from having that in place? And you mentioned, on the tech front there is, but also maybe just on your general sort of performance or recruitment, let's say even. So it's quite a broad umbrella, but where would you take these and apply these to get the most value for the least amount of effort as soon as you've sort of gotten to this point?
So if you take the broader talent value chain and look at the different parts of the value chain, so you could start this talent value chain, for instance, and say, okay, so what is our what does our employer branding look like, and how are we finding our talent, and how are we recruiting that? What do we as our employee value proposition, and how do we sort of say, do employer branding around that? And I think having the language of the competency and technical skills framework in place allows you, for instance, very well, or in a better, more consistent way, to articulate what you're really looking for. So you may look for, let's say, a sales manager, and in something like a job description, you would be better able, and in a sort of say in alignment with others who are doing maybe the same in other regions, to express clearly what you're expecting in terms of what's the overall mindset and the kind of field in which the sales manager would operate, what are our competencies, customer orientation, good communication, a sense for understanding the technical product, but then also to be more specific around articulating the technical skills. So being proficient in maybe running a certain CRM software, or being familiar with the business development process. And I think it allows you to articulate those, job requirements more clearly, and then in the recruiting process also be a little bit more succinct and specific around, well, which part of those competencies, how good do you think you are with them, and some of the technical skills, where do you sort of say hit the mark, and where do you have gaps? If you move on in the talent value chain, so that is recruiting, but then so the next part where you could find this helpful, a competency and skills framework, is in learning and development, right? So when you are reskilling, upskilling, competency-driven programs, technical skills programs, I think it helps to get, sort of say, it right, what you are trying to address. And also, using this example of the business strategy, being also specific. Okay, I understand the business strategy. What competencies would be affected now from that one? Which technical skills do we need to invest in? And so really be specific, and not just be, oh, let's make sure we upskill the organization in its entirety, which is a rather fluffy kind of command. If you move on from, let's say, L&D, performance evaluation, or the entire sort of say people development or people evaluation cycle, it helps sometimes, for instance, employees to, self-assess themselves around competencies and skills, and says, where do I think are my strengths? What are the good things I'm doing really well, and where could I spend more time on? Do I also understand maybe where I have development areas, and where maybe I can help to ask for help or coaching or upskill myself or attend training programs with that? And I think even there, having the language and the nomenclature in place to articulate and talk about this can help to make the conversations much more specific and I think fruitful, instead of, oh, we thought we talked around learning and development for your personal career, but we're not sure if what you understood is the same thing what we understood. So there are different parts of the value chain that could benefit from, let's say, this understanding of a model.
Absolutely. I think what you just mentioned around, we're going to talk broadly around this, but the specificity, because those different terminologies, that can go so many different ways. And I guess once you've got those and you've applied those, and maybe to training and whatnot, where do you see the journey from an L&D perspective of your end employee? So is it something where you see them sort of self-directing themselves and selecting content? Is it something where you're trying to guide the learner down a specific pathway that's best for them? But what have you seen sort of work on I guess the L&D and the content front?
Yeah, I think this is a very dynamic and interesting, part of L&D. I think on the technical skills side, what I would really, may want to, suggest is that you look very hard within your organization, first of all, right, to see can we upskill or expand our skills around those technical elements from within the company, from within the corporation. So is user-generated content or expert-generated content something that we don't procure from somewhere else, but rather bring to life through people inside the business? who know how to do it and use them as experts, and experts that can help to train the next generations around, technical skills? Can we take engineers and let them help us train other engineers around, R&D or product development or the manufacturing or supply chain? Can we take experienced sales professionals who know how to run internally the sales process and business development and help them train the next generation? So I'm a big fan of user-generated content or user-generated professional development that comes out of the organization specifically for technical skills. Doesn't mean that there might be sometimes good experts from outside the company that you want to consult, but it would always look also and maybe first inside the company. Yeah. On competencies, I think it does make sense to, look for external help sometimes to get really an independent perspective on what do we think is good communication really look like, or what do we think our culture, understanding of cultural frames of reference, especially if you're an international company, or do we have a good sense of excellent relationship management and trust-based relationships with stakeholders, and can we use other people who help us with that? Again, I'm not saying that it doesn't help to look into internal experts for that, but I think competencies lend themselves a little bit easier to be informed and sometimes inspired by external experts and external providers as well. And when you bring all this together, I think slowly from your deducting from your needs analysis that in itself is informed by the business strategy and maybe how you talk about it in your competency and technical skill framework, I think you will be able then to deduct from a needs analysis almost a catalog of next steps or interventions, or whatever you're going to call this, which explains, okay, for this particular need, we want to suggest that framework with that content from this kind of source. And for this need, we want to do slightly differently. And so I think it will ultimately look like a toolbox where you put in place what you think is the most adequate a combination here of content, facilitation, and engagement format in order to make sure you're hitting the nail on the head and not just providing a curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love what you said about looking internally for some of those technical skills there. I think that's something that gets passed up or easily glanced over sometimes. And in particular with those technical skills, I can see why you're sort of referencing those as something to look internally for, maybe a little bit more, as that I think that internal knowledge of how that system is used in the context of the organization is really impactful. Once you've gone down that sort of pathway, how important would you see the role of technology in maybe delivering some of this training and getting it to the right people?
Well, very important, but not easy. So I mean, I've been in this place many times, trying to think about technology in a meaningful way, how it can support your L&D strategy or talent strategy. And now from hindsight, I would say it was never an easy conversation. And so my top advice would be is, not to kind of, just run through the minefield by yourself, but to seek proactively counsel and support from a group, from a peer group, from other experts, could be inside the company, could be even externally, to validate maybe, the data points and the hypotheses that you have around which technology may help you to do what. What I can say in general is that technology is important, but it maybe shouldn't be the beginning thought, so to say, in understanding your L&D strategy. I think technology is supporting and helping you to translate what you want to do with your L&D strategy, but it shouldn't be, let's sort of say, the starting point from which you are then exploring what's the art of the possible, what allows my technology me really to do. Having said that, I understand that sometimes you may, reach a point where you'd say, well, okay, either this particular technology doesn't exist, or I don't know whether it exists, or it exists but it's too expensive, or it exists or it's too complicated and I don't have the resources basically to manage it and run it on a continuous basis. Or I'm not even sure if this particular technology provider is the best solution, and it's a little bit hard to acquire a very expensive system only to discover that down the road, so to say, it's not really working for you. So
yeah,
I think, long story short, I think it doesn't make sense to treat technology as a very important factor for L&D, but try as a professional in that ecosystem to try to early on assemble a group of stakeholders or sponsors with whom you can, pressure test hypotheses and also experiment with certain approaches, instead of trying to, by yourself go to the next industry conference and then just, buy different technology components wildly and then trying to stitch them together. That usually fails.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Frankenstein, if you will, of tech stacks, everyone's
probably... The Frankenstein of L&D. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone's seen that once or twice.
And maybe, if you allow me to, maybe I think what are the important components, I think, when you talk about technology? I mean, yes, sooner or later, an LMS, a learning management system, is something you may want to think about. But to be honest, I think you could even, work around a classic LMS in certain situations. Depends on so many factors, right? If you are,
absolutely,
if you're in a 50-person company or 100 or 150, 200-person company, do you need to acquire an LMS and then over-engineer, so to say, for 200 people what the LMS can do? Maybe not. Maybe you can work, around with other business software solutions to kind of create a similar experience for your users. On the other hand, if you're, if you have maybe 50,000 employees and you're working in that, an LMS can be almost life. An LMS change can be a life-changing event for some L&D departments. They sometimes take several years until to run properly, and it's usually quite a long journey that involves IT, finance, sometimes even legal, in order to make a system change on such a big scale really possible. And that's only LMS. I mean, user experience and so on, other things, cloud-based solutions, even for skills, skill mapping or competency mapping software tools, I think can be very important. But the moment we talk about all those components, like we're already, sort of say, just making the whole kind of question bigger, and there's more and more factors in technology that kind of come here together. It can make it almost impossible to hold in its entirety, because there's so many features suddenly popping up that are relevant theoretically for L&D.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe breadcrumbing that approach is probably the way to go. It's easy to get overwhelmed if you go down a pathway of, hey, let's implement everything. It's quite a lot. It's infinite theoretically, really, to be honest. So
yes, exactly. Yeah, I think the intellectual exchange with peers here and with, so to say, friends of the function inside or outside the company, I think is the best lifeline that you really have, right? So again, coming back from, hey, what do we need our technology basically to do for us? Which steps, business process steps around L&D or talent does it need to support? What is already there? What's the biggest need? Is it really something that's out there that would meet that need? I mean, all those questions alone, lots of work and lots of conversations to be had. And there's not an immediate guarantee that everything's going to be sunshine once you kind of understand all those components and have made an acquisition. But can you ignore it? No, you have to deal with it proactively and you have to engage with it. I think there's just no free lunch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess on the technology front as well, how important would you say the data from those different sort of technical stacks is, and have you seen good uses of data before?
So I think there are, well, I think there are different ways to talk about data in that context, right? I mean, you can, well, think about what are metrics or KPIs or data that you're getting from, let's say, a certain offering that you have out there, and then it depends a little bit what your system allows you to do, how much you can track completion or feedback, or maybe, sort of say applicability of learnings then to the real life, or checking in with learners, after 6 months and see whether they could actually translate the learnings into a change in behavior. So all the kind of Kirkpatrick model steps that are, out there, the 1s to 4, moving from, completion, I've been there, towards, oh, I've really changed the business impact. So I think that this is helpful, but I've also seen sometimes that you can spend an enormous amount of resources and time and energy into identifying these, I would say, impact metrics and KPIs around that. And then a little bit, sort of say, the bigger picture gets lost in doing so. So you end up with, I don't know, beautiful dashboards that tell you lots of data points of how your learners engage with it. The question is always like, okay, great, we have this information, so what kind of business decisions are we in place to make with this information? And that's the harder part sometimes, right? So even if we do have these metrics in place, so what are the use cases, or what are the theoretical cases, and then what kind of decisions would we probably expect to be doing there? I think for me, the importance of data grows with the size and the complexity of the company you're working in. Again, if you're an L&D professional leading that function in a 200 to 300 employee kind of company, I would suggest you go a little bit lighter on data, because a lot of the skill needs and a lot of the where do we need to focus on and what really works, you're getting a little bit between the lines and talking to the business leaders there. If you have 50,000 employees or 100,000 employees in your company, you need a certain, foundational data set on what does the talent look like that comes in the organization, what are the expectations around the learning needs that they have or that the business has for them. What are the proficiencies around competencies and technical skills that they may want to, provide in terms of self-assessing or having someone else assess them? What is the impact of learning interventions, and how do they rate that along certain lines? So I think the bigger and more complex the company becomes, the more important data and the analytics of data comes to inform those different steps of the value chain of talent and L&D. Again, usually a very complex field, but probably ever the more necessary going forward in our time. So I think the metric for me is really company complexity and size here that matters most.
Yeah, and I guess that's a scaling sort of effect, right? Yeah. The larger the company, a small tweak might be worthwhile. Yes. Whereas at those smaller organizations, L&D admins, probably instinct is much more accurate because they're close to everybody. So I definitely agree. Yeah. Marco, my last question for you would be, where can people find you and learn more about you and what you do? Thank you so much for coming on, and we're sort of coming up to about an hour now that I've had a really good discussion with you. So I guess, where can anybody listening find a little bit more about you?
Well, I mean, yes, I sit on the usual career networks, just as myself, but I mean, I want to say that, I mean, I'm also a learner in this profession. I would by no means, understand that I know it all. I think I only know probably a little bit of the complexity of the L&D function, of the talent function. So I think it's a never-ending journey, and it probably is for everyone in that field, because it's so dynamic. There's so much change, which is exciting, it's an interesting field to work in, because it brings together the interpersonal side, working with people for the positive, impact, and for the positive change that these employees, your colleagues, can kind of get with your help. And at the same time, it has very interesting fields like tech and analytics and data that are becoming more important to kind of inform the business decisions. So kind of bringing those two worlds together it's a very interesting field. and I guess I'm just a learner in this field, like everyone else, and I need this permanent exchange with, you know, with people who are working in the industry, just to prove my hypotheses right or wrong.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and having a chat.
Thank you so much, Blake.
I'm Blake Probert, and you're watching the Strategic L&D Podcast. If you want to stay up to date with our latest releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you just want the audio, you'll find us on most common podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon.